So welcome to the Microsoft Graph Community Call. We've now switched platforms onto the Microsoft Teams platform, so appreciate you guys updating your calendar links. We have been posting on Twitter and the blogosphere around the fact that the link has changed because we're not servicing this up now on Skype for Business. We're actually in Teams, so we're hoping for a much better experience here with screen sharing and audio. And so just out of respect for the speakers as we introduce them, if you can make sure you have your microphone on mute so we don't hear any background noise of the various different things that are going on in your home office, like I am today, or in your office at work. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Let me just move this down here just so I can see if I get muted again. The link that you can share with people that want to join this call is the aka.ms/Microsoft Graph call link. That will be a link to an ICS calendar invite. You can also add this call directly using the Graph Explorer by going and adding the calendar samples, and inside of the calendar samples there's a add Microsoft Graph call sample that you can run as long as you're signed in as your account, and it'll add it to your calendar. So it's a nice way of trying the Microsoft Graph.
You're muted again.
Thank you. If we can not mute all, Dana, that is...
I'm actually not doing that, so we'll make sure that doesn't
Whoever it is,
again,
stop doing it, otherwise you'll be on Santa's bad list. And so the next call will be in January. It won't be on the first Tuesday of the month because that will be New Year's Day. And I'm sure a lot of people will not probably be as active at 8 o'clock in the morning Pacific time on New Year's Day, me probably especially. So we're moving that call till 9 a.m. on January the 3rd. So the same week, but on the Thursday rather than a Tuesday. And we'll be reminding people nearer the time via blogs and Twitter and so forth, just in case people try and turn up on the Tuesday and realize it's not there. And so today we have two really awesome speakers, and I'm hoping you've been following along with what's been going on here. But essentially Daryl Miller, who is responsible from a PM perspective for the Microsoft Graph SDKs and the Graph Explorer and a bunch of other things. He's going to be giving an update on where we're at with Microsoft Graph SDKs and providing some vision there in terms of what we're going to be doing in the future. And Brian Jackett, who was basically the person that came up with this whole concept of putting together a 30-day series of blogs for Microsoft Graph, is going to walk through what we've done in the month of November. So if you have been following along, you're going to hear from kind of the leader of that in terms of what's been going on there and some of the cool samples and tutorials that you can get through. So if you want to follow these people on Twitter, Daryl Miller is Daryl_Miller, and Brian is Brian T. Jackett. Before I pass it over to Daryl, we do have some kind of overall Microsoft Graph announcement. And the first one, which is really exciting, is that now we have docs.microsoft.com graph documentation. We have heard for a long time that our docs experience wasn't optimal. It wasn't great to try and view these things on mobile devices or iPads and certain browsers. And we decided to migrate over to the Docs platform that many other products and services within Microsoft have actually migrated to in the last year or so. There are some great changes to that. If I just open up a browser here and just go to graph.microsoft.com, essentially from this browser, or any experience you're in where you're in Microsoft Graph, in the top here, you can get straight to that Graph Explorer. And we introduced this Get Started experience at Ignite this year in September. And what we've changed now is that when you click on the docs, we're actually launching over into docs.microsoft.com. The biggest change fundamentally for us was that now we have what we call internally our conceptual documentation, which is more about the learning about the Microsoft Graph and the different services and workloads that are on there. And then we have our reference documentation in the top navigation, which will jump you straight into the V1 reference. And then you can use the version switcher here to switch between the V1 and the beta here. And so you'll see that there's some immediate things that are different in the table of contents because we're in that beta space, such as the to-do and Outlook tasks, which are in there. But if you were in, for instance, the calendar, and we went to go to get event, you'll see right now I'm in the beta, but I can switch between V1 and beta and just see the differences between those two versions very quickly. We kept the most popular and most common content that we see people using once they're at the level of looking at and exploring the reference documents, such as how to go get an auth token and register your application inside of Azure Active Directory, and then all the common things that exist across the different services and workloads in the graph, whether it's how you do paging, how you do query parameters, how you do batch requesting, and the information we have to date on throttling on Microsoft Graph. So all those things are readily available directly there in the graph, but then you can even use the breadcrumbs up the top here, or you can just go back to the overview of the graph to get back into that conceptual learning content, where at a more high level, you can get an understanding about things like what we mean by Office 365 groups in Microsoft Graph, and the various different kind of diagrams that explain what the resource objects map to in their user interfaces inside of Office 365 and broadly more Microsoft 365. And then we heard feedback that people do like jumping straight into beta as well. So from this here, now you don't just get to the API reference. We also have the ability to jump into the beta rather than V1 if your preference is to immediately do that jump. All of the existing documentation links will actually automatically redirect here. So if you've bookmarked those things or you've shared them in blog posts, it will go to the appropriate page that exists inside of this new documentation platform. And this is really just the beginning. Some of the things that we've already done, and I'm trying to think where I will cheat, I will go in reverse, is that inside of the GitHub repo underneath Microsoft Docs, we've always tracked issues here. And one thing that we now allow you to do, if I just find one quickly, I'm just trying to think. There you go. Is that we can actually submit content issues on the pages directly in line with the page now. So if I scroll to the bottom here, you'll see that there's one open issue here where people are asking about a particular team object. Now, we get notified in the backend via it creating that GitHub issue. And as you have created the issue, because you're signed into GitHub to provide this feedback, you'll get notified when we respond. But more importantly, when other people come to this page, they'll be able to see it visibly here. And so we have this kind of linkage there directly back to our docs. We still have a little bit of work to do in terms of working out who the owners are of every page, which we had a conversation about yesterday in our Docs V team. So for now, I'm the owner, so I get all these. So I'm triaging those through to the respective people. But we're putting in place some SLAs so that if you do provide feedback or you have questions here or suggestions for the content, that we will be getting back in a more timely response than we have done in the past. I will just kind of highlight that we're really not troubleshooting issues with your code or with the service here. If you have questions around things not working or getting errors or access denied, please post those on Stack Overflow using the Microsoft-Graph tag. And we do have a team that triage those and assign those to the correct preems as well. This feedback section of the docs is purely for feedback on the content, not the service and not troubleshooting. So please don't get angry if I close the issue and ask you to post it on Stack. We will look at Stack. We're not just fobbing you off to a system to be the community to answer it, but it's just not the right place for us because we have our docs team working on content improvements, which is separate from other people that are helping to answer questions on Stack. And we are looking for more people. So if you do have time and are interested in contributing to Stack Overflow, please reach out to me or anyone else on the team. So it was really exciting to get that project done. There are a bunch of excellent features there that you'll start to notice as you start exploring those docs. And then Jason Johnston, who we work with closely, Darryl and myself, has been working hard to take the work that was done in the GitHub training labs, where you could basically go from zero project all the way through to a completed project calling the graph. Essentially now that's all hosted in docs.microsoft.com. So there'll be a lot more discoverable. They're in the training section of the docs side of the house. And you'll see here that we've got things for tutorials like building your first ASP.NET MVC application. And we walk through registering your app with you, where we have screenshots of exactly how we're doing these things, even down to going and getting and pulling down the Microsoft Graph SDK and adding it to your project. the idea of this training is to really get you to understand the moving parts rather than just downloading a complete sample and clicking F5. You can also get to those training labs by the Getting Started experience. So, for instance, in the ASP.NET Getting Started experience, you can just go to build your first application and we'll jump you straight there. But if you don't have the 20 to 30 minutes to do that, you can actually still go through the quick start experience, which will basically allow you to register an app with your own identity, and then we slipstream that into the zip file, which you then download an F5 or run in whatever IDE you're using, and you'll have a fully working version of your first graph sample. So lots of different ways to get started with a graph once you've kind of looked at the docs and how to play with Graph Explorer. Just a quick reminder, the app registration is still in preview in portal.azure.com. We will be moving over from the current app registration process that we call ARP internally, and driving you all to the portal.azure.com. So if you haven't had a look at that, please check that out. It does allow you to view both V1 and V2 auth registered applications, and obviously is very much driving us towards the MSAL SDK auth libraries as well. And in addition to that, we've been doing these weekly podcasts still. There was a great podcast, if you're a SharePoint dev and you weren't aware of isolated web parts, Luca and Pat from the engineering team actually talked through a lot of the details of why they built isolated web parts and what it means for Microsoft Graph developers in terms of being able to have a web part that's isolated to a particular set of permission scopes rather than kind of running the entire SharePoint page, those permission scopes. So definitely check that out. It's definitely worth listening to on your commute in or when you're chilling at home. And there was a variety of other ones around notifications. And we talked a little bit in detail about user voice as well and the journey we're on there in terms of capturing feedback. And I'm hoping you're noticing that we are going through and updating those statuses. I've still got a few more product teams to work with to get their statuses updated. And now we're in the planning phases of what things on there we're going to try and aim to get done for build 2019. And then also really excitingly, we've had the Security Graph API team present on here a few times now, and they've been on the podcast and they've been blogging and providing samples. But there is a new graph security hack. So we've done a few of these hacks on devpost.com. This one has a really nice set of prizes. First place gets 10 grand USD cash, like those Reddies. So if you are interested and you have some time, basically this is running between December and the end of, or until end of February, March 1st. Please go check that out. There's lots of information on there on how you can get involved in the hackathon and potentially win some of these prizes. And it's a great way to learn about some of these new APIs that are on a graph that maybe you're not so familiar with yet. And then in addition, I will give you time just to quickly put this into your browser of choice. We are looking for more feedback on the graph. There are just 4 required questions. It is totally anonymous. There is a section at the bottom where you can provide any feedback you like in here. Obviously, if it's product feedback, we'd love you to go to user voice and do that. But anything to do with the developer experience or where you're having troubles or anything that you'd like to share with us as a team, I'd love to hear that, and the rest of the team would love to hear it. So aka.ms/graph survey is the place to go. It will take literally 3 minutes to fill out. We're just trying to get a good idea about where we're at and the sense of what feedback we should be taking on board that maybe not directly product related, that we'd love to get your feedback on. So aka.ms/graph survey. And again, these slides and the blog post with the recording will also be available after this presentation. So for our first focus topic, we've got Daryl Miller, who is based in Montreal, Canada. That's just been traveling a little bit. So welcome, Daryl, to the community call again.
Hello, hello.
Hello. So I will hand the baton
back
to you, and I will turn off my presentation so you can share your screen, and I will sit back and enjoy learning about the Microsoft Graph SDKs.
Okay, excellent. Let me see if my PowerPoint skills are up to spec. Okay, share the screen. And do you see my screen?
I do, but I'd like to hear from somebody not at Microsoft that they can see it.
Well, I can no longer see the chat window, so I'll have to rely on you.
We can see.
Excellent. Thanks, guys.
Fabulous. So this is a short talk. I've given it. If you happen to watch the live streamed Office 365 bootcamp, this is a pretty much a similar talk there. But the idea behind this is just to kind of give you a feel as to where we, the SDK team, are trying to go and take the SDKs that we currently have for Graph and improve them based on the feedback that we've been getting. And hopefully we'll get more feedback from you so when you know and understand where we're going here. So this is the talk's called Putting Kit Back in SDK, and I'm going to go fairly quickly because Jeremy gave me a very strict timeline on this thing. So if there are things that you want more clarity on, feel free to reach out to me afterwards, and we can have a conversation offline about it. So SDKs, they're kind of a controversial topic. You get people who either love them or hate them. Even people who are building API providers who don't like SDKs still absolutely need to build them because there are certain people who absolutely demand, customers absolutely want them. Personally, I've always struggled using them, and I've spent a lot of time working with SDKs trying to find what is the right way to deliver a certain amount of capability. And so when I got the opportunity at Microsoft to work on the SDKs, I really jumped at it. Because the problem is, some people, this is how they feel with SDKs. It's a case of, well, you've given me this API surface area, but then they feel limited and constrained because there's no flexibility. They kind of use it the way it was designed, or, well, just kind of throw it away and go back to making HTTP calls. And one of the reasons for this is because many cases SDKs are designed for a primary single use case. And I like to call it the TTFC, which is the time to first call, because often SDKs are all about getting people started, showing how simple and easy it is to get stuff done. And that's critical for onboarding people. But the problem is, like, when you try and design for flexibility in SDKs, it brings in additional complexity. And so that's often avoided with SDKs. And there are other challenges with SDKs in that doing it in just a single language isn't enough. You need to do an SDK in many languages. And in order to do SDKs in multiple languages, really the only cost-effective solution is code generation. And code generation itself is a double-edged sword. It can make some things really easy, but it also makes it easy to create poorly architected code. And often supporting cross-platform in code gen also means just supporting the lowest common denominator. So there are SDK code generators out there, and people sometimes think, oh, well, you just go out and use Swagger Code Gen or just use Autorest, and they infer that it's just a minimal task to get SDKs, but the end result is something that is fairly limited in flexibility. And this is why you end up kind of ending up in this, you either use it all or you use none of it, and which is why many people actually choose not to use them. So, and this is one of the things that we want to fix. And what we really want to try and deliver is a real kit. I mean, it's called an SDK, a software development kit. So we want to be able to allow users to pick and choose certain parts of it so that new users can get a fully streamlined, easy approach. And the folks who are building products like commercial ISVs can get under the covers and just use the parts that they want and have complete control. And they can, the parts they don't want to use, they can potentially build themselves. So we want to be able to provide a set of choices. So where are we going to start with this? So we're going to start with what everybody has on every platform is some native HTTP library. There's some generic interface for being able to do gets, puts, posts, and usually there's some kind of object model for modeling the request message that's sent out and the response model that's come back. And people in many cases are very familiar with this library and want to continue using it because that's what they're used to using and that's what gives them control. What they don't want is to do a lot of kind of the grunt work of dealing with authentication and retry handling and redirect management and a bunch of other kind of cross-cutting concerns. And that's where what we're doing is introducing an architectural concept called middleware. So these middleware components actually sit behind the native library, and many client libraries or native libraries out there across different platforms support being able to just plug in these middleware components. If you're familiar with the .NET HTTP client library, it has this notion called delegating handlers. In Java, they're called interceptors. In Angular, they're called interceptors. And it's a common pattern, and it allows us to do all kinds of nice things for developers without obscuring that native interface that they are potentially used to. So moving on, let's look at some of the other things. One of the problems with setting up middleware is sometimes these pipelines are a little complicated to configure, and then there's a whole set of other capabilities that you might need to configure, like what is going to be the default timeout, and what is the default headers that are set for a variety of other things. And by having a client factory, we can abstract away some of the specific settings that make the most sense for calling the Graph API. So now we have a client factory that will create as a native HTTP interface that we're familiar with and do these cross-cutting concerns. Now, when you're working with the Graph, what actually happens is there's a whole bunch of different interaction patterns that happen that are common across different workloads. Collections work very similarly across many different services. Paging, batch requests, multi-part content. These are common concepts that exist across all different workloads within the Graph. And we are going to build strongly typed wrappers or helper classes effectively in order to help you build those payloads and process response payloads for all that common stuff. There's no point having every developer rewrite something that can understand how to do paging across collections. We can write that once and deliver that functionality to you. Same goes on dealing with responses. There's a bunch of standard ways that we deal with certain status codes that come back from the Graph. There's no point writing the exact same code for dealing with 500s and 404s and 403s when we can have a standard response handler. Again, all these things are completely opt-in. You can choose not to use these, or you can write your own or use the ones that come out of the box. Now, at this point, we've really just talked about the core library, which is none of this is code gen. This is code written by our team, published into a GitHub repo. It's all done in open source, and we accept pull requests. But beyond that, we have the larger Graph surface area. And in order to provide an even better or an even easier experience, especially for new developers, we use code generation based off the metadata for the Graph API, and we build what we're calling the service client. So here, this is kind of the root of the overall API and gives you, for example, in C#, it gives you that root for the Fluent interface to be able to go and discover what capabilities are available. It's your starting point for accessing any service on the Graph. Beyond that, we also code generate strongly typed models in C# and in .NET, C# and Java and TypeScript. And soon we'll also be generating models in Objective-C. And those models help you interpret payloads in a strongly typed manner. And the last part of our code gen layer is request builders. So this is a Fluent interface or a templated interface. We do it different ways in different libraries, and we're going to expand the different types of request builders that are available over time. And they help you construct a request by helping you discover what is and what isn't possible. And as we move on, these request builders hopefully will become more and more sensitive to what is actually possible to do. We still have work to do to help you building selects and expands and filters and things like that. We've got lots of opportunity there. There's one other layer that we also are introducing, which is a higher layer, which we're calling tasks. I'll discuss that in a little bit more detail in a minute. But it's for supporting scenarios where there is a coordinated set of HTTP requests to achieve a single goal. So to dig a little deeper into the middleware pipeline, let's start with our basic. We have a native HTTP client, or it could have the full generated Graph service client. They both use the same middleware pipeline. And we send off a request to the service, and we get a response back, standard HTTP pattern. However, with the introduction of the middleware pipeline, we can all of a sudden transparently handle authorization for you, getting the authorization token, dealing with redirects. We can potentially do caching. We can potentially do long-running operations, handling 429s, and this all will happen transparently behind the native interface. And we have the opportunity. This is a configurable pipeline, so if there's a particular piece of these handlers that you don't want to use or you want to replace it with your own, then you're absolutely able to do that. Now, it gets a little bit more tricky in actually implementing these auth handlers, because with the auth provider, we're not going to rewrite our own auth provider. We are going to basically use the MSAL libraries, which have all the nice token caches and be able to automatically handle refresh tokens. But there's some things that out of the box the MSAL library doesn't do for us. It doesn't store those tokens persistently. So we have an adapter layer that adapts to the MSAL library, and we'll add some additional capabilities, like, for example, being able to use a storage provider to be able to store those tokens. And we also provide a variety of different authorization providers for the different flows, whether it's a device code flow, or whether you're using an interactive flow, or whether you're using an auth code flow, an on behalf of flow in an ASP.NET application. Now, that storage provider that we will have in order to store those tokens, we can use for a variety of other purposes. For example, redirect handling. If it's a permanent redirect, why not store it so that there's no need to make that request in the future? If we have a caching handler, obviously we'll need some kind of storage provider in those scenarios. So we're going to add additional capabilities onto here. Retry handler at the moment, our current implementation is fairly simplistic in the fact that it just takes a 429 and it delays that request for however much time is reported by the retry after header. What we will be adding shortly is the additional queuing perspective, so that it differentiates between if you've got a web service type of scenario where you've got multiple users, it'll put, if one user hits a throttling limit, it won't throttle another user, and vice versa. We'll also have queues depending on what workload it hits, because potentially you might get queued by the messaging infrastructure, but then you want to go call AD, you shouldn't get queued by that one. So this is some additional capability we'll be building in soon. Now, in order to be able to queue by user, we need to know who the user is. And that brings us to another architectural piece, which is request context. So what will flow down this pipeline is a request context that has both a user property provided by the auth handler and also some additional controls that allow you to control the behavior of these pieces of middleware on a per request basis, because they will have default behavior, but you can override those on a case-by-case basis. So that kind of gives you the idea of the architecture of the capabilities that we're trying to insert behind that native HP client library. And we're currently making good progress in a number of different languages implementing this same architecture, because we're trying to do things in a consistent way across the different languages. Moving on to the next piece of the puzzle, which is dealing with requests and content. And one of the challenges from a flexibility point of view that we've run into is in what we're currently code-genning, the request that you're making and the content that is either sent or returned are very tightly coupled, and it's hard to use those independently. And ideally, they should be able to be used independently. You should be able to send any content to any request. Now, that might not make sense for a particular URI, but from a SDK perspective, we want that kind of flexibility. So you have the request, the native request object, and the HTTP client, and the response object, and they both have some kind of body. For creating the request, we have both templated request builders that's part of the core that we use in JavaScript and in iOS, and we have the Fluent request builder that is in C# and Java. When it comes to the request body, I mean, just native client libraries just deal with it with a stream of bytes or a string, but we want to add a lot more intelligence there to make it easier to make certain types of requests, like being able to send batch requests, interpret batch responses, deal with long-running operations, being able to look at the status monitor resource for long-running operations, being able to send multi-part content to things like OneNote APIs, and just being able to deal with collections of objects and get at that next page link. All of this kind of capability we can surface in a more richer way so that you don't have to implement that capability. And just to dig a little bit deeper, we'll also error content and domain types. Domain types are our strongly typed stuff. We already mentioned that briefly. To talk a little bit more about content, and one of the reasons why we split content out away from the actual request itself is because content is a concept that is a completely composable content. And this is really useful when making HTTP requests. So imagine we have some payload, which is a collection of things. We might want to actually stream that across the wire, and you can put content objects inside content objects. This is a concept that's implemented very nicely in C#, and we are trying to mimic that same architecture across some of the other languages. If you have, say, multi-part content, you can embed it inside a compressed content object. Now, all of a sudden, you just have a content object that happens to completely compress, and it becomes transparent to the rest of the pipeline. It's just dealing with some content. And you can go further with this. You can say, well, let's say we could do signing and encrypting. Well, that's great. That would be another capability that would be useful for us. Now, the interesting thing about content objects, it usually represents more than just the content. It also represents some content headers, because although request headers appear in the same place, actually some of the headers are related to the body and some of them are related to the actual request itself. And this is modeled properly in these content objects. Now, the interesting thing is, let's say you had, going back to our first example, we have streaming content. It would be really nice to be able to sign and encrypt that. But actually, that's not possible with regular headers because once you start streaming it, the headers have already been sent. However, interestingly, there is a notion called trailer headers. This is a concept that's been around for a very long time, but nobody's really, until recently, actually made implementations of it. Now in the browsers, the fetch APIs have this notion of trailers. And this is something that we might be able to support in the near future with this model of dealing with content objects independently of requests. Which brings me to my last concept, which is this top level tasks as higher order functions. And the idea is much like a cruise control allows you to say, well, I just want to go at this speed, and then some other mechanism takes care of keeping the car running at that particular speed and dealing with speeding up and braking. Then the idea of tasks is that you have some kind of tasks that you want to achieve. You provide it some kind of input parameters to say, this is what I want to have happen. And then the task actually takes care of making the HTTP requests, returning the response, updating the internal state. It might fire state change events in order to update some UI, and you can perform additional actions on that state depending on the current state and on what you want to do with that task. To put this into a concrete example, although it's a simple example, consider page iteration. You make a request to the API to get back a list of messages from the API, and that might be a paged result. So you get back some of them, and then there's a next link. Well, instead of having to actually grab that next link and call it manually, we now have a page iterator that you basically just set up and say, okay, here's an HTTP client that's already been pre-configured. Here's my initial page of a collection, and here's a callback, because this is what I want to actually execute on every item within that collection. And then you can just say, okay, go iterate over it. And it will take care of following those next page links until there aren't any more next pages. You'll see in the callback, we also have a return true or false the intent there is we could use this to short circuit and say, okay, if some condition is true, actually stop iterating, which allows us to use this iterator for searching across things. So there's a whole bunch of possibilities that we can build around this concept of tasks and provide higher order capabilities in order to access the Graph SDK. So all of our SDKs are open source. They're in the GitHub repo Microsoft Graph. And the requirements that we are using internally within our team to design what these SDKs are doing are in the Graph SDK design repo. So if you want to understand the direction that we're going, you want to make comments and open issues and say, you should also do this too, feel free to participate in that repo. And the docs for our SDKs currently are kind of spread in a few different places. Some of them on the GitHub wikis, some of them are just in folders in the GitHub repositories. We will be moving those also to to docs.microsoft.com, and we will also soon have reference docs available via the API browser that's available currently for all of the .NET Framework libraries and other Azure SDKs. So look out for those coming fairly soon. And with that, thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks, Daryl. There was one question around whether we have a Go SDK for the Microsoft Graph. I believe we don't have that currently, right?
We currently do not have a Go SDK. We've had a couple of people ask for it. It would be a really interesting thing because, again, it is a strongly typed language, so it would fit fairly well and wouldn't be too terribly different from our C# one. I'd be definitely interested in hearing more about the scenarios where people are finding themselves wanting to use Graph to talk to SDK, to wanting to use Go to talk to Graph APIs, because it's...
So I recommended graph.microsoft.com and then click support at the top, which will get you straight into our current user voice place where you can go and create an entry there. I did look, there isn't one already, so I recommended in the chat that they kind of put that there, and then other people can contribute and vote up to kind of increase the demand. We are doing a lot of work based on that demand, and especially if there's more details in the comments of the feature requests as well, makes it a lot easier for the PMs to understand the priorities and the scenarios where this would make sense to unlock. So the more detail you can provide, the better. Okay, so thanks for that, Daryl. I'm going to hand over to Brian, Brian and Shrivnaz now, to talk a little bit about the 30 days of Microsoft Graph. So welcome, Brian and Shrivnaz. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jeremy.
I will let you share your screen, I guess, Brian.
Yep, I'll flip over to mine here. All right, can everyone see my screen here now?
Yeah, we can, yep.
Excellent. All right, welcome everybody. My name is Brian T. Jackett. I'm a Senior Premier Full Engineer at Microsoft, and we also have Srinivas on the call as well. We'll say hi, Srinivas.
Hello, everyone.
Excellent. So the whole idea for this 30 Days of Microsoft Graph series, I saw a need from a lot of different folks with customers internally at Microsoft. We're going through different kinds of domain knowledge and whatnot. Looking out into the community, we saw that, hey, there wasn't really any Microsoft Graph series out on Pluralsight or out on LinkedIn Learnings. There wasn't anything that was dedicated just to it. You know, it'd be kind of a small relegated portion of a different offering or whatnot. But we're kind of hoping for, hey, I want to have kind of a learning path to get myself, from a starting point all up to at least having a little bit of kind of familiarity with what we can do in Microsoft Graph. So what you'll see is that we've got content going throughout the whole month of November. All of our content has now been published. We've got the link down here at the bottom. You can see the aka.ms/30days MS Graph. And the idea was essentially to ramp people up, whether you're a developer or an IT pro. It's more developer focused. We do have some good content in there for IT pros as well. Basically go from a 0 level knowledge all the way up to a 200, maybe 250 level. And we did a mix of different combinations for content for this. We had a number of blog posts. We've got a GitHub repo with this. And every single day also has a try it out exercise. So not only can you read about this, but you can actually go put it into practice and be able to actually see some results and actually get some content to be able to work with this. There wasn't a absolute distinct kind of separation here, but it kind of worked out well that the first half of the series is a little bit more theory based. So you're going to see a lot of stuff around, what is Microsoft Graph? Why should I learn it? How can I work with the Azure AD application registrations? What's the way to do batching or different kind of query string manipulation for my requests? And then as you move into the second half of the series, you've got days 15 through 30, more focusing on kind of real world samples. So there's actually going to be doing things in .NET Core, and we're actually building out samples, whether it's going to be talking to just the graph itself, to the Azure AD endpoints, to SharePoint, to OneDrive, to Planner, to OneNote, a lot of other kind of technologies that are all touching on the Microsoft Graph. What can you actually do with those? And what was really interesting was we started out with kind of a small set of what we wanted to accomplish. We were actually able to include a lot more than just that. We started out with more of the kind of application flow, so doing the client, confidential client, where we're talking literally as a app service. We also have some samples in there doing device code authentication, so you can do some user mode, as well as doing some implicit flow. So if you're doing something in TypeScript or JavaScript, you can also have a way to work with those. Now, a lot of these different kind of samples, as Jeremy was mentioning a little bit earlier, with some of the getting started things, you're seeing where, hey, I can go from scratch and build this thing out in 15, 30 minutes or so. We also have some pre-baked demos where you can actually go to the repo for this, do a clone of it, pop in your own app ID, your tenant ID, and some other information, and it'll actually be up and running in just a couple of minutes. So that's actually something I'm going to demo here in a few minutes here. Just want to share these links again at the bottom, the aka.ms 30 days MS Graph, and also the try it out exercises out on the GitHub repo for Microsoft Graph. You'll find it under this 30 days MS Graph -try it out. So just show you kind of a quick little overview of this for our blog posts. We do have that one kind of main announcement page. And off of there, what's really helpful is you can link to any one of the 30 days of blog posts. So if you're really interested in specific topics, you can go to those things directly. The idea is that almost all of these blog posts don't require you to go through every single day. If you're only interested in certain ones, you can actually land on those ones. And if there's any kind of references back, the kind of key highlight ones on here, you'll see a lot of the posts that reference day 9 and 10, which is creating or registering your Azure AD app, either on the V2 endpoint or on V1. And also a lot of them reference back to day 15, which is kind of our, here is your core .NET Core sample just for a base project. Now, and I will mention one other kind of thing related to this .NET Core. We did get some feedback from different community members saying, hey, why is everything as a console app? Why isn't there more that's available as a website or whatnot? And I will profess right now that I am not a .NET Core expert in this area, but from a lot of what I've read, it is actually very easy to convert things over from that console application into a web API or into a MVC website or other kinds of applications. You can even see things like Azure Functions being a way to host this going down the line. So something we've taken as feedback and we may actually implement as we go along once we get a little bit more time under our belts, to add some more additional capabilities to this to show some of those different areas. And also showing you over here, this is our repo for the try it out exercises. Again, you'll notice every single day, we've got a markdown file that kind of shows you, here is what you'll be working through with links off to either the repo or to other additional instructions for working with those different areas. So without further ado, I'm going to jump over into our repo and show you just a kind of quick example of doing the clone and being able to build and get up and running very, very quickly with this. So over here on our website, you'll see that we've got this .NET Core console sample, which is one of our repos underneath the Microsoft Graph organization. And inside of this, just at the very bottom, you'll see a quick little links off to the different kind of content that's available in here. You can also go into any one of these separate folders. And what's really unique about this is because of the architecture for doing .NET Core, not only do you get the cross-platform ability to kind of run this anywhere, but also we can have separate projects in subfolders and be able to not have them conflict with each other in terms of what dependencies they require or whatever else. So with each one of these separate subfolders, so here's our kind of base console application. we've got quite a walkthrough here on literally step-by-step being able to build this out yourself. So if there's any kind of questions that you have or anything else that you'd like to see updates-wise on this, we do have up at the top, we've got any kind of issues, or you feel free to submit pull requests for this, way for you to get involved and also see updates as we go along with this. But I'll show you kind of a quick example here. If you start out with the base project here, you can go ahead and do the clone or download. And I already have this on my machine, but if you're working with something like GitHub Desktop, you can also see in here, got my repository for this. Master branch is the primary one that you're going to want to work with. We also have a couple other ones for feature branches or the kind of development environment where we're doing our integrations. But if you open this up inside of your folder, do a simple open folder in VS Code, which I've already got over here. Now, by itself, when you first get this application open up inside of the folder here, you'll want to do a couple things. So there's only really a couple commands you need to actually get this up and running. You'll start with a .NET restore. This will restore any of the NuGet packages that are currently referenced in that subfolder for the project. You can do a .NET build. And then you can do a .NET run. Now, when I actually run this run on here, it's going to fail for a very specific reason. And it's going to say, hey, you're missing your app settings.json file. So for every single one of our kind of sub-projects, this is the one piece that you have to add into this to get actually a working kind of sample. And we do talk about this in the README file. So you can see I've actually pulled up the README file for this project on here. And the permission that we're going to need for this is having the user.readAll. And there's also a separate section on here for what permissions you need for this application. So if I go and create a new file, app settings.json, now I've already got the pre-baked version of this that I need. So I can actually reuse this across all the different applications that I'm creating. I'll go ahead and paste this in here. Save that. And now if I go back and do a .NET run, it's actually going to fail one more time. And this is going to relate to what permissions does this application actually need to run. So you'll see in here I got a insufficient privileges to complete the operation. So again, remember back to this README file. The one permission I need for this one sample to work is this user.readAll. So I'll jump over to the Azure portal. And I've already created this application for myself. And it's just simply this .NET Core Graph tutorial. You can name it whatever you'd like to. This is mine. I'm going to go down to the API permissions. I'm going to add a permission for this. Choose Microsoft Graph. In my case, I'm doing application permissions because I'm using the confidential client. Some of the other examples will show you with delegated permissions, though, when you get into Planner or OneNote or some of the other ones. And we'll do a quick search for user.readAll, add permission. And for those that are not familiar, if you do have any of the applications or any of the permissions that require admin consent, I love the fact that the new portal will actually show you on here, hey, you're missing some kind of consent for this application. You also get your little banner up top. So I'll go ahead and say grant admin consent for this, and yes. There we go, get my little green check boxes. Everything should be all happy now. And I can go back down here and rerun my .NET run. And there you go. So now I actually have output from this. And let's actually jump over to our code real quick so you can see what actually is all happening in here. I have to give a personal thanks to Daryl for leading quite a bit of the contributions for this base sample on here. He really walked us through where is the Graph SDK going. So you're going to see a lot of helper libraries in here for this MSAL authentication and also the auth handler. What you'll see in here is not similar to what you see in some of the current documentation out on the web. This is actually the very forward-looking way of doing authentication. So if you're kind of looking for where's the MSAL libraries going, take a look at these samples and you'll see kind of the way that the structure for authentication and kind of calls are being sent into here. But anyways, so we can see here we're creating a graph service client as well as an HTTP client. So you have both of them available to you. In our example, we're going to load settings from our settings file. We're going to create a new graph service client, and we've got a kind of helper method for doing that. We're going to make a simple query, and we're going to look for the graph client.users.request, pass in our options, which is literally just the first user inside of our Active Directory. and we'll make our call to get the result for this and put this out to the console. And then we'll do the exact same thing doing HTTP client. We'll go ahead and get a client for this. We'll make our call to the exact same endpoint, users, pass in for the top one, and then make our request there and push this out to the console. And that's what you can see down here. I've got my Graph SDK result as well as my HTTP result put out to the line. Now, end to end, if you're to do the clone, put in place your app registration, put the app settings file together, realistically, this should take you about 5 to 20 minutes, depending on how much you have pre-baked or whatnot. But it's a very repeatable process, and we've actually taken this so that now for each one of the days underneath of our repo, you can go into creating users in Azure AD, assigning licenses for Office 365, modifying mailbox settings, assigning permissions in SharePoint, and so forth. So lots of quick and easy ways to be able to work with this. I'll show you one last example on here, which is doing the device code authentication. So this is under day 20. I'll go ahead and open the folder in Visual Studio. And we're going to need to do the exact same thing. I'm just going to do app settings.json. And for this one, I have a separate registration for it. There are certain flags that you need to set in Azure AD for the manifest, as well as the settings for your application. So these are some things that are just a little bit different. And so I actually have two separate applications because of that. It's a little bit easier for me to be able to work with both of them side by side. And save. Now, anyone who is familiar with doing something like with the Azure CLI, which is our command line interface tool, this is a very similar flow that you're going to see in terms of being able to generate a user context while still being in a non-interactive session. Let's go in here. Oops, keep losing my terminal. .NET restore. .NET build. Ooh, something's taking up some background processing here. While I'm waiting on this, Srinivas, do you want to talk about any of the kind of go-dos or things people can work on while they're going through some of the sample content? Srinivas is still there?
Yes, Brian, I was talking on mute.
Yep,
thank you. Yeah. Firstly, thanks for the opportunity to talk on this community call, Jeremy. So I have 3 requests for the community. My first request is for the community is to spread the word, which you do the best. So spread the series, the 30 days Microsoft Graph series within your network, with your customers, with your clients that you work on a daily basis. And as Bryce mentioned, the second half of this series is all about code samples, and each day has its own try it out exercise, right? So my second request is please go try out those exercises, and if you find any issues in the code or the content, please let us know by either opening a GitHub issue or a direct message on Twitter, or just put a message on the Twitter, right? And we would love to continue to support and update the blog post based on your feedback. And finally, my third request is I would like to call out the survey link that we posted on the final day article. Let me paste the So that's the link for the survey. So feel free to fill out the survey. It's a very short survey. And I think that will help us to continue to come up with similar ideas or build on top of this, come up with something totally different, right? Ultimately, that is going to benefit all of us, right? So thanks a lot. And back to you, Brian.
Thanks very much. So just to show you an example of what the device code flow looks like, when you do your .NET run inside of the sample, you're you're going to see this new little pop-up message on here saying, hey, go to this URL and paste in this code. So this is a very similar process to what you see if you ever tried to activate a new device for Spotify or for a lot of other kind of services, maybe YouTube or whatnot. They'll send you a one-time code. You need to paste that into a browser when you're already authenticated as your user, and then you can actually accept that and basically grant a user context to wherever you're running this from. So in this case, I'm going to copy this little code here. I'm going to go over to my browser session where I'm already logged in as my account that I want. I've already got the URL kind of pre-primed on here, login.microsoftonline.com. Oops, there's actually a better one down here, microsoft.com/device login. That'll redirect you over to this other URL. I can paste in my code, hit continue. Because I'm already logged into my account, I just need to go and choose that from this session. This will, hey, thank you, you've signed in for this. If you need to consent to any kind of permissions, they'll prompt you for that. You can click the accept for that, and then you're free to kind of close this browser session down. And if I go back over to my session, here you go. So I did my first request, and I get my graph results. Now, because the HTTP client is using a separate kind of authentication for this, it's not going to be universal between those, and it's actually going to ask me to sign in again in this session. Most of the samples, though, they will only use one flow or the other. They're not going to cross over back and forth between HTTP and using the graph. This is kind of a special case. Go and again, sign in as my user. And see this updates with that result. So again, all in all, a quick and easy way to kind of start getting up and running with Microsoft Graph. We would love to hear any kind of feedback that you had. Again, as Srinivas mentioned, flip back over to our slides. And again, here is the link for this if you're looking to provide any kind of feedback for this. Put a lot of hard work into this. Hopefully this is helpful for everyone in the community. If you have any feedback, if you have any suggestions, if you'd like to see more of this type of work, your feedback is really what kind of fuels this. You know, this is not our day jobs for most of us putting this kind of content together, but it does help in terms of getting management to notice and kind of put some effort into this. So again, thank you for the time, Jeremy, and I'll turn it back over to you.
That's awesome. Thanks very much, guys. I really appreciate that. That has been a huge help for us in getting a lot of traffic to that site. And I know we've had a lot of requests from people that joined this call and MVPs that have kind of been driving and pushing Microsoft Graph already. So if you would like to contribute to this, it is definitely something that we're looking to do more in January and beyond. We're giving December a bit of a break just to kind of really learn from what we've done here and work out which platforms we want to target the next series of articles on and how deep and broad we go with these things. But it's been a great exercise to kind of have people from what we call the field in terms of kind of the premier field engineers like Brian and Srinivas, as well as people like Gavin Barron and a bunch of other MVPs that have contributed, and also the PMs that are in Microsoft Graph as well. So it's a great kind of like cross-community thing to be involved with. So if you are interested, please reach out. There are definitely a bunch of bounties, as we like to call them, for content that we'd like to include moving forward. So if you're interested and you have some time, we have kind of like almost like little mini specs that you can go away and grab and take these things to the next level. So please go check those out. And if you haven't touched the graph, the blog series is just a really great way to kind of get started and understand what is capable in there. Not just for developers, but I've been setting this a lot when I do exec meetings here on campus with kind of C-levels that just want to kind of read the first few of those articles to get a good understanding about what the graph is, just so that when they go back to their offices and to speak to developers, they've got that kind of information in their head to grasp what's possible for them as Microsoft 365 customers. So just a quick reminder, next call will be January the 3rd on a Thursday, not the Tuesday. We typically do Tuesday at 8 a.m., but next month we'll be doing it on Thursday at 9 a.m. on January the 3rd. If you have any questions you'd like to ask, please feel free to use the Graph Call questions link there. That really guides who we try and get on to showcase things on this call and kind of do topics around those things. That's a great way to kind of get deep dives into things you want to see more. There was a bunch of questions in the messages that I'll definitely take offline and tweet once I find the answers, or request that we get some feature requests in user voice to kind of move those things forward with the different PM teams. And then I know Brian Srivastava asked for survey results on the 30 days series. but there is a set of PMs internally that would really like to hear your feedback about the broader Microsoft Graphics developer experience. So if you could take the 5 minutes to fill out both, we'd really appreciate that. It's aka.ms/graph survey. We will be doing these on a regular basis, and it will help us to understand where we should prioritize on improvements across the entire Microsoft Graph developer experience. So please fill that in and give as much feedback as you can, because it really helps us to understand where we're weak, where we're strong, and where we should be investing efforts moving forward. And hopefully you've seen the docs improvements and the graphic Explorer improvements will be coming soon, as well as the Microsoft Graph SDK stuff that Darryl just showcased. So we are listening, and we're always listening on Twitter and the different forums that we encourage you guys to go to. So please keep in touch, and we'll see you in January. Have a good holiday period, and keep in touch. Thanks, guys.